She was just a struggling waitress until a mysterious man left her a check for $1 million. Sarah's life felt like a perpetual cycle, a never-ending rotation of early mornings and late nights at the diner. She stumbled into the worn-out establishment just as the sun broke the horizon, already anticipating the chaos of the day. The diner, bustling with clattering plates and voices shouting orders, was her stage, and she played her part as the overworked waitress with a smile plastered on her face. The constant demands from customers, the grumpy regulars, and the ungrateful patrons created a whirlwind she was forced to endure. Her hands ached from the constant movement, and her back screamed for relief, but it was all part of the job. With each passing shift, Sarah's exhaustion deepened, but she carried on, knowing that the bills would keep piling up if she didn't. The exhaustion, the weight of it all, was etched in her features, but she kept pushing forward, taking each order and refilling each cup of coffee, as though it were the only thing that kept her afloat. Her financial situation was a constant weight that pressed against her chest, suffocating her in moments when she allowed herself to think about it. The overdue bills, the student loans that felt as if they would never go away, and the looming rent payments made her stomach churn with anxiety. She lived paycheck to paycheck, scraping by just to survive, never mind dreaming. In the quiet moments of the night, when she sat alone in her small, dimly lit apartment, she would remember the dreams she once had, dreams of creating art, of running her own gallery, of living a life beyond the confines of a diner. The promises of a different life, one where she was free to create and thrive, felt like distant memories. The walls of her apartment, no matter how much she tried to personalize it with paint and decor, always seemed to close in around her. Her current reality, shaped by her mother's illness and her father's absence, left little room for hope. She worked long hours, gave up her personal time, and sacrificed her dreams for the simple need to survive. The emotional toll of it all was immense, and she could never fully silence the internal conflict that raged within her. Her dreams were slipping further away, and the reality of her day-to-day life seemed to make it more impossible than ever to reach them. Sarah's memories of her father's disappearance haunted her in the quietest moments of her day. He had vanished from her life years ago, leaving her and her mother to face the world alone. Her mother, unable to work due to her illness, had forced Sarah into a role she wasn't ready for, one where her dreams were sidelined for the practicalities of life. The burden of her mother's illness fell heavily on her shoulders, and the emotional strain of their relationship became more apparent as the years passed. Her mother, though kind-hearted, refused to ask for help, too proud to admit how much she needed her daughter. It created a rift between them, one Sarah didn't know how to mend. She was caught between her responsibilities and her own desires, torn between caring for her mother and longing for a life that didn't revolve around constant sacrifice. Her father's absence had left a hole in her heart that she didn't know how to fill. She resented him for leaving, for abandoning her mother and her when they needed him the most, and yet the absence of his presence left her with a gnawing emptiness, a feeling she couldn't shake. The diner, the place that should have been a temporary job to get by, had become her prison. Every day, she dealt with cruel bosses, unsympathetic colleagues, and customers who treated her like a servant rather than a person. The constant barrage of insults, demeaning comments, and passive-aggressive behavior from both her coworkers and the customers chipped away at her confidence. Each year that passed, she felt more stuck, more incapable of moving forward. She had no idea how to break free from this endless cycle. There were moments when she would catch a glimpse of her reflection in the diner's worn-out mirrors, and she hardly recognized herself. Her youthful energy had been replaced by the tired eyes of someone who had given up too much of herself. And yet, there were moments of brief respite, rare instances when a customer would offer her a kind word or a smile, and it would remind her that there was still a part of her that was capable of hope. But even those fleeting moments couldn't mask the overall sense of despair that had begun to define her life. At times, Sarah's mind would wander, reflecting on the dreams she had long abandoned. She remembered the paintbrushes, the sketches, the passion she once had for her art. She had dreamed of opening a gallery, of showcasing her work to the world. But life had a way of sweeping those dreams away, one responsibility at a time. Her creativity, once a defining aspect of who she was, now felt like a distant memory, an old version of herself she could no longer access. But sometimes, as she served food or refilled drinks, little bursts of creativity would surface. A fleeting idea for a painting or a composition would cross her mind, and for a moment, she would feel alive again. But those moments were always followed by the overwhelming weight of reality. The knowledge that she couldn't afford to pursue her art, that her future was tied to a job that drained her more each day. The internal battle between hope and despair raged inside her. She didn't know if she could keep living like this, but at the same time, she was terrified of what her life would be like without any dream to chase. Marie, the older waitress who had worked at the diner for years, was a steady presence in Sarah's life. Marie's simple, content life stood in stark contrast to Sarah's constant restlessness. Marie had long since stopped dreaming, settling into a routine that allowed her to find peace in the small things. She lived for the steady paychecks, the small talk with customers, and the comfort of knowing exactly what each day would bring. Sarah envied Marie's ability to find solace in the routine, but at the same time, she feared that Marie's lack of ambition was a reflection of what her own future might hold if she didn't take a risk. Their friendship was a strange mixture of support and warning. Marie had settled for what she had, and her advice often urged Sarah to do the same. "You're never going to make it, kid," Marie would say with a chuckle, not maliciously, but with a resigned wisdom. "The world doesn't owe you anything. Just keep your head down, do your work, and you'll be fine." Sarah knew Marie was trying to protect her from the harsh realities of the world, but the thought of never chasing her dreams made her feel suffocated. She was caught in an internal struggle between the life she wanted and the fear of failure. She had no idea how to begin, how to take that first step toward something different. When Sarah received the phone call about her mother's growing medical debt, it felt like the last straw. She had been drowning in bills for months, barely keeping up with the rent, and now this? The weight of responsibility crushed her chest, leaving her gasping for air. She could feel the burden growing heavier with each passing day. Her mother's condition had worsened, and the constant medical bills were a reminder that Sarah couldn't escape. She wanted to ask Marie for help, but pride and shame kept her from doing so. Asking for help was something she had never done. She had always been the one to take care of others, never the one to rely on anyone else. The thought of asking for help, of admitting she couldn't handle everything on her own, felt like a failure. She had no idea what to do next, but she knew she couldn't keep going like this, caught between the demands of her job and the ever-growing financial strain. It was at this breaking point, when everything seemed like it was falling apart, that the mysterious man entered the diner. Victor Dalton, impeccably dressed and oozing an air of quiet confidence, walked in one afternoon, ordering his coffee with a calm that immediately caught Sarah's attention. He didn't fit in with the usual crowd of rough-edged customers who filled the diner each day. There was something about him that felt out of place, something magnetic in the way he carried himself. Sarah was intrigued by him, but she couldn't have known then just how much his presence would change her life. He was different from everyone else, and that difference was what drew her in. As she served him, she wondered who he was, what brought him to this mundane place filled with exhausted waitresses and weary customers. What she didn't know was that Victor Dalton was about to offer her a chance at a life beyond the diner, a life she never thought possible. Victor finished his meal and left a generous tip, but it was what he left behind that would change everything. As Sarah cleared the table, she noticed an envelope tucked under the empty plate. At first, she assumed it was a forgotten receipt or a business card. But as she picked it up, the weight of it made her pause. Inside, she found a check for $1 million, accompanied by a note that simply read, "For someone who deserves a chance." Her heart raced in disbelief. She stood frozen for a moment, staring at the check in her hands, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some sort of mistake, a cruel joke. But no, the check was real, too real. The realization hit her in waves, and she felt a mixture of excitement and fear flood through her. $1 million. It was more money than she had ever seen in her entire life. It was enough to pay off all her debts, to give her mother the medical care she desperately needed to finally pursue her dreams. But as quickly as the rush of hope surged within her, the doubts and questions began to cloud her mind. Was this a gift? Or was it something else? Who was Victor Dalton, and why had he chosen her? She stared at the check for what felt like an eternity, caught between the overwhelming sense of possibility and the deep suspicion that gnawed at her gut. What did he expect in return? There had to be a catch. She had never believed in things that came too easily, and this felt too good to be true. Sarah's fingers trembled as she placed the check back in the envelope, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Should she cash it? Should she throw it away? The options seemed too stark, too impossible. If she took the money, it would change everything, but could she trust the source? Could she trust him? Victor Dalton was a stranger, and yet he had given her this extraordinary gift without even asking for anything in return. Or had he? For the rest of the day, Sarah went through the motions, serving customers and pretending to be the same cheerful waitress she always was. But inside, her mind was racing. The thoughts about what to do with the check consumed her. She couldn't talk to anyone about it. There was no one she could trust with something so life-altering. She could already hear Marie's voice in her head, warning her to be cautious, to be wary of the kind of people who gave out such large sums of money. Marie had seen too much of the world's harsh realities to believe in anything that came too easily. And yet, Sarah couldn't ignore the feeling that this might be her one chance to escape the life she had resigned herself to. She could pay off her debts, pursue her art, and finally have the freedom she had always dreamed of. But what if it wasn't real? What if this was a scam, a trap, or worse, something that would entangle her in ways she couldn't predict? Later that night, alone in her apartment, Sarah lay in bed, the check resting on the table beside her. She thought about the days that had led her here, the exhaustion, the struggles, the dreams deferred, and the way it all felt like it was slipping through her fingers. If she didn't take the chance now, would she ever get another one? Was this the universe's way of telling her that she deserved more, that she was worth more than the life she had settled for? The fear of losing this opportunity, of never knowing what could have been, gnawed at her insides. But the fear of what it might cost her was even greater. She couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's gesture was more than just charity. It was a transaction in disguise, and she wasn't sure if she was willing to pay the price. Days passed, and the decision weighed heavily on Sarah's mind. She went back to the diner, pretending everything was normal, but she couldn't stop thinking about the check. It felt like a lifeline thrown her way, and yet she couldn't bring herself to grab it. She would occasionally glance over at Marie, wondering what advice she would offer, but she never found the courage to ask. Marie's life was simple, uncomplicated, but Sarah knew deep down that she couldn't live the same way. She couldn't settle for what she had. The dreams that had once burned brightly in her heart were still there, smoldering beneath the surface, waiting for the chance to ignite. But at what cost? The following evening, as Sarah walked out of the diner after another grueling shift, she found herself walking towards the alley behind the restaurant, where she often took a moment to collect her thoughts. She had been avoiding going home, avoiding the quiet of her apartment, where the weight of the check felt like it was pressing down on her every time she looked at it. She needed to make a decision. She couldn't keep living in limbo. It was then that her phone buzzed in her pocket, interrupting her thoughts. She pulled it out, expecting it to be a reminder for another bill that she couldn't afford, but it was a message from an unknown number. She opened it, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. "Did you get my gift?" It was Victor. Her heart skipped a beat, and a sense of dread swept over her. He knew. He knew she had the check. And now, there was no turning back. The message was brief, but it carried with it an unspoken weight, a feeling of inevitability. She stared at the screen for a long time, trying to understand the implications of his words. What did he want from her? What did he expect? The questions flooded her mind, and she knew that there was no escaping the web that was slowly tightening around her. As Sarah stood there, her hands trembling from the weight of it all, she realized that the moment of truth had arrived. She could no longer hide from the reality of what this money meant, what it could do for her, but also what it could cost her. Victor's game had already begun, and now she was a part of it, whether she liked it or not. Her fingers hovered over the phone, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of clarity. It was time to make her choice. Sarah sat in the quiet of her apartment, the check resting in her trembling hands. She stared at it in disbelief, her mind racing with questions she couldn't seem to answer. Was this real? How could it be? She turned the check over, her fingers brushing over the smooth paper, trying to find any sign of fraud or mistake. $1 million. She had never seen so much money in her life, and yet here it was, staring back at her like an impossible dream. Her thoughts spiraled. Was this some kind of elaborate hoax? A cruel joke meant to humiliate her? Or was it a gift, a blessing from someone who saw potential in her she had long since given up on seeing in herself? The weight of a decision pressed heavily on her. If she cashed the check, it would change everything. Her financial struggles, her sense of security, and her future. But could she really trust this man, Victor Dalton? She knew nothing about him except that he had given her this enormous sum without any explanation. It didn't make sense. Nothing in her life had ever been that simple. Her instincts told her to be cautious, but a part of her, the part that dreamed of a different life, begged her to take the risk. It felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. Yet, that same part of her felt an overwhelming sense of unease, like she was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't fully comprehend. Sarah knew she couldn't make this decision alone. She needed to talk to someone, but there was no one she trusted more than Marie, the older waitress at the diner who had seen everything life had to offer. Sarah dialed her number, hoping Marie would offer some kind of clarity. When Marie answered, Sarah could hear the surprise in her voice as she explained the situation. At first, Marie was silent, taking in the gravity of what Sarah was telling her. Then, she responded with a mix of shock and skepticism. $1 million? Just like that? Marie asked, her voice full of disbelief. I don't know, Sarah. This sounds too good to be true. It doesn't sit right with me. Sarah's anxiety mounted as she listened to Marie's conflicting emotions. Her friend was both concerned and intrigued, torn between her protective instinct and the curiosity about what such an opportunity could mean. Marie's words offered no comfort, only more questions. Sarah was left feeling even more uncertain about what to do. Despite Marie's concerns, Sarah knew she had to take the next step and verify the check's legitimacy. She couldn't just take Marie's word for it, nor could she continue to carry the burden of this decision without knowing for sure. The following morning, she took the check to her bank. She waited nervously as the bank manager examined the check, his brow furrowed as he confirmed the authenticity of the document. His reaction was one of all mixed with doubt. He agreed to process it, but not without expressing his own uncertainty about how it came to be in her possession. For a brief moment, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope, a fleeting sense of relief. But that feeling quickly vanished when she realized that the questions about Victor's intentions remained unanswered. The bank manager had been helpful, but now the uncertainty loomed even larger. The check was real, but who was Victor Dalton? Why had he chosen her? In the days that followed, Sarah's mind was consumed with the mystery of Victor's disappearance. She tried to find any trace of him, any clue that could explain his actions, but it was as though he had vanished into thin air. There were no records of him at his supposed company, no references to him in business circles, and no online presence that could shed light on his identity. It was as if he had never existed. Sarah was left with only the gift and a growing sense of unease. What had she gotten herself into? Was Victor a phantom, or was he someone far more dangerous than she had ever imagined? The unanswered questions gnawed at her, creating an ever-deepening void of doubt and fear. With each passing day, Sarah's guilt grew heavier. The more she thought about the check, the more it felt like a curse rather than a blessing. Who was she to deserve such a gift? What did it mean to accept money from a stranger, especially when that stranger's motivations were shrouded in mystery? Sarah knew that others, many others, were struggling far more than she ever had, and the thought of accepting such a fortune, especially without understanding why it was being given to her, filled her with dread. She wondered if taking the money would make her complicit in something sinister, something she couldn't yet see. She didn't want to be used, manipulated into playing a part in a larger game she didn't understand. And yet, The allure of a different life, of escaping the crushing weight of her debts and responsibilities, was undeniable. As if to add to her growing anxiety, Sarah received a phone call one evening, an unknown number flashing on her screen. She hesitated for a moment before answering, the air in her apartment suddenly feeling thicker, more suffocating. "Sarah," the voice on the other end of the line said, low and cold. "It's Victor." Her stomach dropped at the sound of his voice. "Don't trust anyone," he warned, his tone cryptic and unsettling. "The money is yours, but there are consequences. Prepare yourself." The call ended abruptly, leaving Sarah shaken to her core. The cryptic nature of Victor's message sent a shiver down her spine. What consequences? What had she gotten herself involved in? The weight of the situation pressed down on her even harder now, and she felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of whether to take the leap or retreat into the safety of her old, familiar life. Her emotional turmoil reached its peak as she sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by the clutter of her day-to-day life. The opportunity of a lifetime lay before her, but it came with a price she couldn't yet fully comprehend. What if it was all a mistake? What if she wasn't worthy of this chance? The fear of the unknown, the fear of what might happen if she accepted the money, gnawed at her. Yet at the same time, she couldn't ignore the part of her that longed for the freedom, the possibility of a life beyond the diner, beyond the endless struggle. She was caught between hope and dread, a tug-of-war that left her paralyzed with indecision. The isolation she began to feel from her friends and family grew steadily. She couldn't bring herself to talk to anyone about the check, about the mysterious Victor or the promise of wealth. She feared their judgment, their envy, or worse, their concerns that she was making a mistake. Keeping the money a secret only added to the weight of her isolation. It was as though she were living in a shadowy world where she could trust no one, not even herself. Her sense of control over her life had evaporated, replaced by a nagging feeling that she was being watched, manipulated, and controlled by forces far greater than her own understanding. Every moment felt like she was treading water, unsure of whether she was heading towards safety or drowning in the deep, murky waters of uncertainty. After weeks of mental and emotional turmoil, Sarah finally made a decision. She would cash the check. It was both exhilarating and terrifying to think about. She was stepping into a new world, one that held both promise and danger, and she had no idea what the future would hold. But the possibility of a better life, of being free from the crushing weight of her current reality, was too tempting to resist. She went to the bank, handed over the check, and watched as the clerk processed it. The money was real, and now it was hers. The feeling was overwhelming, a rush of excitement mixed with fear, as though she had just stepped off the edge of a cliff and had no idea what lay beneath. The changes began almost immediately. New clothes, a new apartment, and a sense of freedom she had never known. She could finally breathe without the constant weight of bills and debt hanging over her. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope, a flicker of what could be. But as the days passed, that feeling of hope was tempered by an unsettling sense of surveillance. It was subtle at first, an odd phone call here, an unanticipated encounter there. But soon, it became clear that someone was keeping an eye on her. Victor's presence seemed to linger, even in his absence, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being controlled by forces she couldn't see. The money, the opportunity, the life she had always dreamed of, it all seemed too good to be true. And now, she was beginning to wonder if it was. As Sarah's new life unfolded, the weight of her decision continued to hang over her like a dark cloud. The initial thrill of newfound wealth and freedom soon gave way to a gnawing sense of unease. Every luxury, every small indulgence that she allowed herself, seemed to be overshadowed by the persistent feeling of being watched. The excitement of buying new clothes, of moving into a sleek, modern apartment, was marred by an underlying tension she couldn't shake. At times, she would catch glimpses of shadows in the corner of her vision or hear strange noises in the hallways of her building, and she couldn't help but wonder if Victor was somehow keeping tabs on her. The changes in her daily life were undeniably significant. No longer burdened by the weight of overdue bills, Sarah felt a sense of relief she had never known before. The pressure that had once shaped every decision in her life, from how to stretch the last of her paycheck to which bill to delay paying, had evaporated. She could buy groceries without the constant dread of running out of money, and the thought of paying rent on time no longer caused her stomach to knot in anxiety. Yet, for all the tangible improvements in her material life, something deeper, more unsettling, was beginning to take root. The isolation grew more pronounced. Sarah avoided talking to her family about the windfall she had received, too afraid of how they might react. She couldn't bring herself to tell Marie, who had been such a trusted confidant, about the money. The more she kept it a secret, the more she felt like a stranger in her own life. She wondered if this new life was truly hers, or if she had somehow become a puppet, controlled by forces beyond her understanding. The fear that Victor might be watching, that he might have placed some kind of invisible hold over her, crept into every corner of her mind. She became hyper-aware of her surroundings, always cautious, always on edge. At night, when the lights were dim and the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, Sarah would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. Her mind would race, replaying every conversation she had with Victor, every moment she had spent agonizing over the decision to cash the check. What had she gotten herself into? Was she truly free, or was this wealth just another form of imprisonment? She thought back to the cryptic phone call he had given her, warning her to trust no one, and the chilling words echoed in her mind. There are consequences. Prepare yourself. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's unease only grew. She began to feel like a character in a story she had no control over, a puppet dangling on strings she couldn't see. Despite the wealth that had given her a taste of the life she had always dreamed of, she couldn't escape the fear that there was a darker side to her newfound fortune. Every decision she made, every new step she took, seemed to bring her closer to something she didn't understand, a force she couldn't name but felt all around her. She couldn't tell if the fear she felt was a product of her own imagination or if it was something more sinister, something that Victor had planted in her life with his gift. She considered leaving the apartment, escaping to somewhere far away, where she could disappear from the clutches of whatever was watching her. But the thought of abandoning everything, of giving up the new life she had worked so hard to build, was terrifying. She wasn't sure if she could go back to the life she had before, working at the diner, struggling to make ends meet, drowning in debt. That life was gone now, and there was no way to return to it. She had to confront whatever was coming. But how could she when she didn't even know what that was? One evening, after a particularly restless night of tossing and turning, Sarah decided to visit the bank once more. She hadn't been back since she had cashed the check, and the weight of her thoughts made her feel as though the decision to cash it had somehow sealed her fate. She needed reassurance, something tangible to hold on to in the midst of her growing anxiety. Maybe the bank manager, who had been so baffled by the legitimacy of the check, could offer some insight into what had been happening. Maybe there was some way to trace Victor's movements, to understand his intentions more clearly. But when she arrived at the bank, the manager was gone. The new employees didn't know anything about her case, and they seemed dismissive when she asked about the check. The lack of answers only deepened her confusion. Was she being paranoid, or was something truly out of place? The nagging feeling that she was being followed, observed, grew stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just in her head. She could feel it, could sense eyes on her whenever she ventured outside, whenever she stepped into a new situation. No matter how many locks she turned or blinds she drew, the feeling of being watched remained. Her phone began to ring more frequently, but each time it was a number she didn't recognize. At first, she ignored them, convinced they were sales calls or random solicitations. But when the calls persisted, and each time the caller hung up as soon as she answered, her anxiety reached a fever pitch. It wasn't just the eerie silence at the other end of the line. It was the timing. It felt like someone was trying to manipulate her, trying to rattle her, to make her question her own decisions. She had no evidence, no way of proving it, but deep down she knew that Victor was somehow still involved in her life, still pulling the strings. Then one afternoon, she received an unexpected visit. A man in a dark suit knocked on her door, introducing himself as a representative of a philanthropic organization that was interested in offering her further opportunities. He was polite, well-spoken, and unervingly persistent. He spoke about the chance of a lifetime, about how Sarah's life was now on a new trajectory, one she could never have imagined. The words felt rehearsed, as if they had been carefully planned out, and the more he spoke, the more Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. It was clear that he knew everything about her background, her struggles, and the sudden wealth she had come into. But what unnerved her the most was the way he looked at her. His eyes held an intensity that made her feel like she was a mere pawn in a game she didn't understand. As the man left, leaving behind a business card with an address and a promise that they would be in touch, Sarah felt the walls closing in on her. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had been drawn into a world of shadows, a world where she was no longer in control. The money, the freedom, and the new life she had dreamed of, all of it seemed to be slipping through her fingers like sand. The more she tried to hold on to it, the more it felt like something was trying to pull her deeper into a web she couldn't escape. Her thoughts were clouded with fear, guilt, and confusion. What had Victor done to her? What had she allowed herself to become? Every choice she made now seemed fraught with danger, with consequences she couldn't predict. But as much as she feared the unknown, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't go back. There was no returning to the life she had before, no way to escape the dark forces that had entered her world. All she could do was move forward, into the unknown. Sarah's new apartment felt like a dream come true at first, a stark contrast to the cramped, dimly lit place she had once called home. It was spacious and modern, with a view that took her breath away each time she looked out the window. She bought a new car, the sleekness of it almost surreal. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to worry about the constant strain of money, of counting every dollar, of deciding which bill to pay first and which one to let go unpaid. The thrill of financial freedom was intoxicating, but it was also overwhelming. She had always dreamed of a life like this, but now that she had it, she struggled to enjoy it fully. Every purchase, every new experience felt hollow at times. The weight of the uncertainty about how this all came to be lingered in the background, a reminder that nothing about her new life was as simple as it seemed. Despite the material improvements, something inside Sarah was shifting. As her lifestyle changed, she began to feel more distant from the people she had once been close to. Her old friends barely recognized her, and she found herself unable to relate to them in the same way anymore. They didn't understand the complexities that had come with her sudden wealth. Her family, too, felt like strangers now. Sarah had always been the one who struggled, the one they had to worry about, and now that she had a fortune at her fingertips, she didn't know how to share that with them without feeling guilty. Her mother, at first, had been thrilled for her, but over time, Sarah could see the concern creeping into her eyes. There was no simple way to explain how she had come by the money, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her success had created a barrier between them that she couldn't bridge. The loneliness that accompanied her new life was unexpected but undeniable. The wealth had opened doors, but it had also isolated her in ways she never anticipated. As the days passed, Sarah began to feel an unsettling unease. The luxuries of her new life became increasingly hard to enjoy, knowing the shadow of the money's origins loomed large. She couldn't stop asking herself where it had really come from and why Victor had chosen her to receive it. What had she done to deserve it? And was there something darker behind his generosity? The questions gnawed at her, keeping her awake at night. She tried to push them aside, to enjoy the freedom she had always longed for, but they kept resurfacing. What did he expect in return? What strings were attached to this windfall that she had so carelessly accepted? Unable to find peace, Sarah decided to take matters into her own hands. She began to research Victor, desperate to uncover more about the man who had turned her world upside down. What she found shocked her. Victor Dalton's reputation was far from pristine. Whispers of corruption, unethical business dealings, and a trail of failed investments followed him wherever he went. Stories of ruined lives and broken promises seemed to be tied to his rise to power. Sarah was horrified as she uncovered more and more, and the questions in her mind grew louder. Had Victor done something similar to her, using her as part of some larger, more sinister plan? She couldn't ignore the fact that his generosity had come with no explanation, no clear reason why she, of all people, had been chosen. Her initial gratitude began to sour, replaced with suspicion and fear. The more she learned, the more she felt trapped in a world she hadn't asked to be part of. As the weeks went on, Sarah started receiving more cryptic messages from Victor. They came in the form of emails, handwritten notes, and even anonymous phone calls. Each message offered advice on how to use the money wisely, how to protect it, how to avoid the pitfalls that had brought down so many others who had come into wealth suddenly. The tone of the messages was increasingly paternal, as though Victor were watching her every move, guiding her from a distance. Sarah began to realize that she was no longer making her own decisions. Every step she took, every choice she made, seemed to have already been predicted, subtly influenced by Victor's guidance. It felt as though her autonomy was slipping away, and she was tethered to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. The once alluring idea of wealth had begun to feel more like a cage, and Sarah could see the bars closing in around her. It wasn't long before Sarah's family, particularly her mother, began to voice their concerns. At first, they had been happy for her, proud of her newfound success. But as time passed, her mother grew more insistent, urging Sarah to be cautious, to think critically about the source of her wealth. She had lived through hard times and knew better than anyone the dangers of trusting something that seemed too good to be true. Sarah tried to brush off her mother's warnings, convincing herself that everything was fine. But when her estranged father unexpectedly returned, seeking to reconnect and take an interest in her success, her suspicions grew. The timing of his return seemed too convenient. She couldn't shake the feeling that his reappearance was somehow linked to the money. He had abandoned her and her mother years ago, and now, after all this time, he wanted to be a part of her life again. It felt manipulative, and the thought that Victor might have had a hand in it made Sarah's skin crawl. The emotional toll of the situation was starting to take its toll on Sarah. She found herself torn between the growing mistrust she felt toward Victor and the lingering gratitude that still remained from the initial gift. She wanted to believe that he had done something kind for her, that he had given her a chance to start over. But the more she uncovered, the more she realized how much she had been manipulated. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a larger game, and the realization left her feeling empty. She felt betrayed, not just by Victor but by her own father, whose past sins were now haunting her. The emotional devastation of being used in such a way was unbearable, and Sarah struggled to reconcile the version of events that she had been living with the cold reality that was slowly emerging. The breaking point came when Victor himself appeared at Sarah's door, ready to reveal the full extent of his manipulation. His calm demeanor, his careful choice of words, and his lack of remorse only made the revelation more gut-wrenching. Victor explained that the money had not been a gift at all, but part of a long-planned revenge against Sarah's father, who had once been involved in a business venture that had ruined Victor's life. Sarah was stunned, unable to process the enormity of what she was hearing. She had been nothing more than a tool in Victor's quest for vengeance, and the weight of that knowledge shattered everything she had believed about the money. The anger, the betrayal, and the hurt washed over her in waves, and she felt like a stranger in her own life. The emotional devastation was overwhelming. Sarah had spent so many months trying to make sense of her life, trying to build something new, but in an instant, everything she thought she knew crumbled. The relationship she had with Victor, once full of hope and gratitude, was now tainted by manipulation and deceit. The money she had once seen as a blessing was now a symbol of her exploitation. Her emotions were a storm. Shock, anger, regret, and betrayal all intertwined, leaving her feeling hollow. She questioned her judgment, her trust in others, and the choices she had made. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, and she felt utterly lost. In the aftermath of Victor's revelation, Sarah was left to confront the tangled web of relationships that had bound her to him and to her father. She had never imagined that a single gift could unravel her life in such a way. She had been living in a dream, thinking that she had escaped her past, only to find herself ensnared by it in a different form. The ties that had once seemed so promising, so full of possibility, had become chains. As she tried to come to terms with what had happened, she was left with more questions than answers. What did she do now? How could she possibly move forward when everything she had built was built on lies? Her future, once filled with hope, now felt uncertain, and the road ahead seemed impossible to navigate. Sarah sat in the silence of her apartment, her mind spinning as the truth of Victor's words sank in. The ties that had once seemed so simple now felt impossibly tangled, and the future she had envisioned for herself was slipping away, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread and uncertainty. She had been so desperate to escape her past, to find a new life beyond the struggles and limitations she had known. But in doing so, she had unknowingly walked straight into a trap. Her father's sins, the choices he had made long ago, had brought her to this point, and now she found herself caught in a web of manipulation, revenge, and betrayal. The revelation of Victor's true intentions hit her like a physical blow. For so long, she had thought of the money as a second chance, a way out of her mundane existence. She had allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a fresh start, only to discover that it had all been orchestrated by a man seeking revenge on her father. Everything she had come to rely on, the new apartment, the new car, the sense of security, felt like a lie now. She could no longer ignore the uncomfortable truth. Nothing in her life had come without a price. Victor had carefully crafted this entire scenario, using her as a pawn in a twisted game of revenge that she had never asked to be a part of. The more Sarah reflected on her situation, the more she felt the weight of her choices. She had accepted the money without question, without understanding the full consequences. At first, she had been blinded by the allure of freedom, of the possibilities that wealth seemed to promise. But now, she realized that those possibilities had come at the cost of her autonomy, her sense of self, and her relationships. The isolation she had felt before had only deepened in the wake of the money's arrival. She had distanced herself from her friends and family, unsure how to explain the sudden change in her circumstances without revealing the truth behind it. Her mother's concerns, her father's sudden return, all of it had been part of a larger picture she had failed to see. As Sarah tried to piece together the fragments of her life, she felt an intense internal struggle. She was no longer the person she had been before receiving the money, and yet she didn't know how to reconcile the person she was now with the one she had once hoped to become. The dream she had held onto for so long seemed more distant than ever, overshadowed by the weight of Victor's manipulation and the guilt of having been complicit in it. She thought about the life she had imagined for herself, the art gallery she had once dreamed of opening, the creative projects she had abandoned, the future she had planned for when she finally found a way to break free. Now, all of that seemed like a distant memory, an illusion that she could never reach. The emotional toll of her situation began to take its toll on her mental health. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was constantly being watched, that Victor's influence still loomed over her despite his absence. She couldn't make a decision without wondering whether it was truly her choice, or whether she was being subtly guided by him. Every purchase, every step she took, felt like it had been preordained. Even the simple act of enjoying her newfound wealth felt like a betrayal of herself, of her past, of the person she had hoped to become. She had wanted freedom, but instead, she had found herself trapped in a gilded cage. Her relationships, too, began to deteriorate further. Her mother, despite her earlier concerns, tried to be supportive, but Sarah could sense the underlying tension between them. She didn't know how to explain the guilt that weighed so heavily on her or the fear that had taken root in her heart. Her father's return only complicated things further. He seemed genuinely interested in her success, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that his reappearance was more than coincidental. Had he known all along what was happening? Had he been part of Victor's plan in some way? She couldn't answer those questions, and the uncertainty only deepened her sense of isolation. The emotional devastation Sarah felt after Victor's revelation was profound. She had once believed that she could control her destiny, that she could carve out a life for herself on her own terms. But now, she was forced to confront the harsh reality that her fate had been shaped by forces beyond her control. The betrayal she felt at the hands of Victor and her father left her feeling lost, unsure of who she could trust or what her future could possibly hold. The money that had once seemed like a solution to all her problems now felt like a curse, a reminder of how far she had fallen from the dreams she had once cherished. In the wake of Victor's unveiling, Sarah was left standing at a crossroads. She had the money, but she didn't know what to do with it anymore. She could no longer use it as a way to escape her past or as a means to create the life she had always wanted. The guilt of accepting the money, knowing it had come with such sinister motives, weighed heavily on her heart. She felt as though she had been manipulated into a life she never asked for, and now she had no idea how to move forward. The relationships that had once grounded her seemed broken beyond repair, and the future she had imagined for herself felt increasingly unreachable. Sarah's mind was clouded with doubt, anger, and sadness as she faced the fallout of her choices. The ties that had bound her to Victor, to her father, and to the wealth she had received now felt like chains, and she couldn't see a way to break free from them. The emotional devastation she had experienced in the aftermath of the revelation left her feeling hollow, and she wasn't sure how to fill the void. She could no longer rely on the false promises of wealth to bring her happiness, but she didn't know what else to hold on to. As Sarah grappled with the consequences of her decisions, she was forced to confront the reality of her situation. The ties that bound her were not just external. They were internal as well. The guilt, the fear, the sense of betrayal, all of it was rooted deep within her, and it was up to her to find a way to heal and move forward. But the path ahead seemed unclear, and the weight of her past hung over her, preventing her from moving on. It was a journey she would have to take on her own, but she couldn't see where it would lead or whether she could ever truly escape the ties that had bound her. Sarah's life, once a simple and steady existence, had spiraled into chaos since she received the money from Victor. The comfort and power she had briefly felt from her newfound wealth now seemed hollow. What had once seemed like a golden opportunity was beginning to feel like a prison, its bars invisible but suffocating nonetheless. The emotional strain of living in secrecy, of being constantly watched, weighed heavily on her. Every step she took felt like a step further away from the life she had hoped for, and the money that had promised freedom had only led her into deeper turmoil. Sarah found herself questioning whether the money was ever truly a blessing or if it had been a curse all along, carefully designed to trap her in a web of manipulation and deceit. Victor's true intentions were made painfully clear when he sent Sarah a chilling message. The message wasn't just a reminder of his presence in her life. It was a revelation of his deeper, darker motives. His desire for revenge had been the driving force behind everything that had happened. Sarah had been nothing more than a pawn in his elaborate scheme. His message exposed the depths of his manipulation, and as she read the words, Sarah felt her trust in him shatter completely. The man who had once seemed like a mysterious benefactor, offering her the chance to escape her past, now appeared in his true light as someone who cared for nothing but his own vendetta. Her emotions were a jumbled mess of anger, betrayal, and confusion. The man she had thought she could trust had been using her all along, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken life. The betrayal didn't end with Victor. Sarah's estranged father, James, appeared unannounced at her door, his face drawn with guilt and regret. His presence only deepened the storm of emotions already swirling inside her. With trembling hands and a voice full of sorrow, James confessed to the role he had played in Victor's downfall. Years ago, he had made decisions that had ruined Victor's business, causing the financial ruin that had driven Victor to seek revenge. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process his words. Her father's betrayal had started the entire chain of events that had led to her entanglement with Victor, and she realized that the scars left by her father's abandonment were far deeper than she had ever acknowledged. His admission forced Sarah to confront a painful truth. Her father's actions had not only led to the downfall of someone she now saw as a manipulative figure, but had also destroyed her own sense of security, leaving her with a legacy of distrust and pain. Sarah found herself in an impossible situation, torn between loyalty to her family and the need to protect the life she had created. She felt paralyzed. Should she side with Victor, secure in the wealth he had given her? Or should she sever ties with him to protect her family from further harm? Her anger toward her father, who had been absent for so much of her life, complicated things further. She longed to walk away from Victor and the money he had given her, but the fear of losing everything was overwhelming. The choices before her were stark. Align herself with Victor, protecting her newfound wealth, but further entrenching herself in a life of manipulation, or sever ties with him, risking everything she had gained. As the days passed, her internal turmoil deepened. Every option seemed like a betrayal of something or someone she cared about. The pressure mounted even further when Sarah's connection to Victor became public. The media, ever hungry for scandal, discovered her ties to him and painted her as a willing accomplice in a web of corruption and deceit. The once anonymous waitress had been thrust into the spotlight, and the public's judgment was swift and brutal. Headlines screamed her name, dragging her reputation through the mud. The weight of the media's scrutiny pressed down on Sarah like a heavy stone, and the isolation she had already felt was now compounded by a relentless, invasive spotlight. She could no longer escape the consequences of her actions, real or perceived, and the strain was beginning to show in the way she carried herself. The pressure from the outside world only made her feel more isolated and helpless, and she found herself inching closer to her breaking point, unable to cope with the relentless barrage of criticism and judgment. Unable to ignore the turmoil any longer, Sarah confronted Victor. The meeting was tense, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. She demanded to know why he had chosen her for his twisted plan, why she had become the target of his revenge. Victor's response was cold and calculated. He laid out the grim ultimatum before her: remain loyal to him, and she would secure her future in wealth and power, but walk away, and she would lose everything. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but understood. Sarah felt her stomach churn as she listened to Victor's manipulative words, the reality of her situation hitting her with full force. The freedom she had once dreamed of was slipping further from her grasp with every passing second. Her future was no longer her own. It was tied to a man whose only interest in her was as a means to an end. In the midst of this chaos, Sarah turned to her mother for guidance. Her mother had always been a source of wisdom, even if their relationship had been strained at times. Sarah confessed everything: the money, Victor's manipulation, and the emotional turmoil that had consumed her. Her mother's response was one of quiet strength. She reminded Sarah of her inherent worth, of the integrity that had always defined her, even in the hardest of times. It was a simple conversation, but it provided Sarah with the clarity she so desperately needed. Her mother's words reminded her of who she truly was, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of calm wash over her. It wasn't about the money or the power anymore. It was about making the right choice for herself, even if it meant walking away from everything she had gained. With a newfound sense of clarity and strength, Sarah made the decision to sever ties with Victor. It was not an easy choice, and it came with a heavy price. She returned the money, leaving a note for Victor that expressed her refusal to be part of his revenge scheme. The decision was both empowering and devastating. She was walking away from a life of comfort and security, but she was also reclaiming her autonomy. She was no longer a pawn in someone else's game, no longer controlled by the forces that had tried to manipulate her. It was a painful decision, but it was also a liberating one. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like she was in control of her own destiny. The future was uncertain, but she was willing to face it head-on. The road ahead would not be easy. Sarah had given up the life she had once dreamed of, and now she had to rebuild from the ashes. The emotional toll of the decision was heavy, but there was a sense of freedom that came with it as well. She reconnected with her family, starting to mend the broken bonds that had kept her distant for so long. She began to rediscover the person she had been before Victor had entered her life, the person who had once dreamed of something better, who had believed in her own potential. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced the darkest part of her life and come out stronger on the other side. Now, She was ready to embrace the uncertainty of the future, determined to build a life that was truly her own. Sarah stood on the threshold of a new life, the weight of her decisions still fresh, but the sense of empowerment growing with every passing day. The life she had once dreamed of, with its promises of wealth and security, had slipped through her fingers, but in its place, she found something far more valuable: freedom. She no longer had to worry about being controlled or manipulated, no longer had to live in constant fear of Victor's influence. The money, which had seemed like the answer to all her problems, had only brought her closer to the edge of despair. Now, she was free to reclaim her own path, to live life on her own terms. As Sarah began the slow process of rebuilding, she focused on the relationships that had always mattered most to her: her family. Reconnecting with her mother had been a step in the right direction, but there was more work to be done. Her relationship with her father was still fragile, but she knew that forgiveness, though difficult, was the only way forward. They had both made mistakes, but now they had the chance to heal the wounds of the past. Sarah understood that rebuilding her life meant not just focusing on her material well-being, but also on the emotional connections that had been fractured over the years. With her family, she began to find a sense of stability again. The support she had once taken for granted now became her foundation, and it gave her the strength to move forward. The media storm that had once surrounded her began to die down, and though the damage to her reputation could never be fully undone, Sarah no longer let it define her. She had learned that her worth was not determined by the opinions of others, but by her own actions and choices. She no longer feared the judgment of the world. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself beginning to dream again. The future, once clouded with doubt and uncertainty, now appeared before her as a vast, open expanse. She was no longer bound by the fear of losing what she had gained, but instead, she felt the excitement of creating something new, something that would truly reflect her values and aspirations. There were no shortcuts or easy answers, but Sarah was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. She had learned the hard way that true freedom came not from wealth or external validation, but from within. As the days passed, Sarah started to put her plans into motion. She didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it. She explored new opportunities, including pursuing passions that had long been buried under the weight of her former life. Whether it was starting a new business, furthering her education, or simply living in the moment, Sarah was determined to take control of her destiny. No longer tethered to the manipulations of others, she embraced her power to create the life she truly wanted. Through it all, Sarah never lost sight of the lessons she had learned: that integrity, family, and self-worth were the most important things in life. The path she had walked had been long and filled with obstacles, but it had led her to a place of strength and clarity. She no longer allowed herself to be swayed by the promises of easy wealth or fleeting success. Instead, she found fulfillment in knowing that she had stayed true to herself, even in the face of overwhelming temptation. The storm that had once seemed so all-consuming was now behind her, and as Sarah stood at the edge of a new chapter, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. The uncertainty that had once filled her with dread now held a sense of excitement and possibility. No matter where the road ahead led, Sarah knew that she was capable of navigating it with courage, integrity, and hope. The future was hers to shape, and she was determined to make it one worth living. Sarah returned the money with a sense of finality, feeling the weight of it lift from her shoulders. She had been given a chance to restart, and this time, she was determined to do it on her own terms, without shortcuts or the burdens of ill-gotten wealth. She moved back into her modest life, the one she had known before the storm, but now there was a new sense of purpose in every step she took. As she began to rebuild, Sarah found solace in painting again, a passion she had abandoned years ago. The act of creating art became a therapeutic process, a way for her to channel the turmoil and chaos of the past into something beautiful and meaningful. Each stroke of the brush felt like a small step toward healing, a release of the emotions that had been bottled up inside her for so long. Her relationship with her father, James, was a complicated one. But Sarah knew that healing could only happen if she was willing to take the first step. Their history was marred by betrayal and abandonment. But as they began to speak openly, Sarah saw the raw vulnerability in her father's eyes. James shared his own regrets and struggles, and for the first time, Sarah understood the weight of his own pain. It wasn't an easy decision, but Sarah chose to forgive him. She realized that forgiveness was not just for him, it was for her too. Letting go of the anger that had poisoned their relationship allowed her to breathe again, to move forward without the burden of resentment hanging over her. Her mother, who had always been there for her through every trial, became an even more central figure in Sarah's life. Together, they began to dream of a new future, one that would combine Sarah's passion for art with her mother's unwavering support. The idea of opening a small art gallery felt like a beacon of hope, a place where Sarah's work could be shared with the world and where they could both invest in something meaningful. As they worked tirelessly to make the dream a reality, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for her mother's presence in her life. The gallery wasn't just a business venture. It was a symbol of resilience, of the strength they had found in each other after everything they had been through. Meanwhile, Victor's empire, built on manipulation and deceit, began to unravel. His dark influence and the consequences of his actions caught up with him, and he retreated from the public eye, leaving behind a trail of broken lives. Sarah heard whispers of his fall from grace, but she didn't feel the same sense of satisfaction she might have once hoped for. Instead, there was only a lingering sense of melancholy for the man he had been and the choices he had made. She wondered if he would ever find redemption, but the truth was she no longer cared. Her own journey had taken on a life of its own, one that was no longer tied to his twisted legacy. As Sarah poured her heart into a collection of paintings for the gallery's first exhibit, she found herself facing both fear and excitement. Each piece she created reflected a chapter of her life, capturing the pain, the struggles, and the growth she had experienced. This exhibit was more than just an opportunity to showcase her work. It was a moment of personal triumph, a turning point in her life. The fear of failure was still there, but it was now tempered with a sense of determination. Sarah was no longer looking for external validation. She had found her own voice, her own path, and she was ready to share it with the world. The grand opening of the art gallery was a testament to everything Sarah had worked for. The crowd that gathered was a mix of old friends, former customers from the diner, and new admirers of Sarah's work. Marie, her loyal friend, was there to offer her support, proud of how far Sarah had come. The event was a celebration of the community that had always been there for her, even when she had felt lost and alone. It was a reminder that success wasn't just about money or fame. It was about the people who stood by you when everything else fell apart. One of the most poignant moments of the night came when Sarah's father, James, surprised her by purchasing one of her most meaningful paintings. It wasn't just an act of financial support. It was a gesture of pride, of redemption. James had always struggled with feelings of guilt and regret, but in that moment, he showed Sarah that he believed in her, that he saw her strength and the person she had become. The gesture brought Sarah to tears, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the full weight of their reconciliation. It was a symbol of their mended relationship, a sign that they could move forward together, no longer burdened by the past. As the night wore on and the gallery buzzed with excitement, Sarah received an unexpected letter from Victor. It was brief, cryptic, and filled with a mix of regret and admiration. He expressed his sorrow for using her as a pawn in his scheme, though his words still carried an air of ambiguity. Sarah read the letter with a detached sense of finality. She had no need to dwell on his fate or his motivations anymore. Her journey had moved beyond him, beyond the manipulation and the chaos he had brought into her life. She had taken control of her own destiny, and that was all that mattered. The exhibit was a resounding success. Visitors connected with Sarah's work, finding resonance in the themes of pain, growth, and resilience that each painting portrayed. For the first time, Sarah felt validated not by wealth or external approval, but by the authenticity of her journey. The gallery, once a distant dream, had become a reality, a place where Sarah's art could be shared with the world, and where she could find peace in the act of creation. Her paintings had become a testament to her resilience, a visual record of her transformation from a woman trapped by fear and manipulation to one who had found her own strength. As the night drew to a close, Sarah stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by her work and the people she loved. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, and ultimately, the redemption. She had lost so much, but in the process, she had gained something far more valuable: her integrity, her sense of self, and the unwavering support of the people who mattered most. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Sarah knew that she was ready to face whatever came next. She had learned the hard way that true success wasn't about wealth or fame. It was about staying true to yourself, finding strength and forgiveness, and embracing the future with hope and confidence. As she gazed at her paintings one last time, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. The future was hers to create, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it fully.